Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here again with Dr. Todd Shackelford, Distinguished Professor and Chair of Psychology at Oakland University. And we're here today to talk about the Sage Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology. I mean, we're going to get into some of its most important topics, of course not all of it, because it's a very extensive book. So Dr. Shackelford, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on the show again.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I'm very happy to be here and to be talking about the new Sage Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, this is basically an interview also to try to, I've already had several interviews on the show about evolutionary psychology, and I talked about very specific topics, but I also wanted to give perhaps an overview of what evolutionary psychology is about to people. So, I mean, if I were to ask you what is evolutionary psychology, what would be your answer?
Well, I mean, I could sort of frame it in different ways depending on the audience, but as briefly as possible, I would say that evolutionary psychology is the study of the mind with the explicit application of Darwinian principles of natural and sexual selection. Evolutionary psychology is really psychology as the way it is properly conducted. I mean, with an understanding and appreciation of our evolutionary history.
Right, but I mean, and this is perhaps a question that really gets to the crux of the kinds of things that lead to misunderstanding. So what is evolutionary psychology really interested in studying? Is it behavior? Is it the brain? Is it psychological mechanisms or something else?
Sure. I mean, evolutionary psychology, I mean, again, you're going to get one evolutionary psychologist's take on this. I think the crucial focus of evolutionary psychology should be on psychological mechanisms, on the information processing mechanisms of the mind, not on expressed or manifested behavior, not on the biological, material of the brain. It's not that that's irrelevant. It's just that that's not, that's the details. But the crux of the discipline, I would argue, should be on information processing, on the cognitive machinery of the mind, rather than the physiological machinery of the mind, or, for that matter, on the expressed behavior that's produced by evolved mechanisms of the mind.
Yeah, I think this is a very important question because sometimes, particularly when people look across cultures and they see differences, superficial differences in terms of behavior, they immediately conclude that we are completely different cross-culturally. But I mean, when we look down into the psychological mechanisms, then that's where perhaps we get the human universals.
Yeah, and that's where you find adaptation, psychological adaptation, is in, the so-called design of the mind. The design features that characterize the mechanisms of the mind. Certainly, you see cross-cultural differences in behaviors, but these differences in behaviors can be produced, and frankly are produced by, differences in environmental inputs, for example. And I think it is, it's a slippery sort of appreciation. It can be difficult for people to appreciate that the focus, I would argue, should not be on, for example, number of babies produced, on reproduction, on the actual, reproduction itself. Of course, in the ancestral past, it's differential reproduction that built these evolved psychological mechanisms. But measuring reproduction in the current, the current environment, I don't think gives you anything useful, tells you anything useful, whether you're talking about humans or birds or any other species.
Right. So just to look back in history a little bit, what are the sorts of disciplines from which evolutionary psychology derived most of its theories, I mean, not theories, but perhaps theoretical foundations. So, for example, I know that evolutionary biology was a
Sure.
big one of them. So, would you like to tell us about that and perhaps about other disciplines from which evolutionary psychology derived its theoretical foundations?
Sure. I mean, absolutely, you're right. That I mean, evolutionary psychology is. I think of it as a branch of biology. I think of it as a branch of evolutionary biology. Um,
Right.
I mean, some people would argue that Darwin himself was the first or one of the first evolutionary psychologists. I mean, I think towards the end of Origin of Species, I'm sure many of your listeners know that he basically made a comment to the effect that, you know, light will be thrown on the origins of man, and psychological, sort of our psychology will be understood, with this perspective of evolution by natural selection. So certainly evolutionary biology and sort of classical Darwinian natural selection is an important, contributor. It's the sort of main framework for understanding modern evolutionary psychology. But I mean, psychology itself and the focus on the mind and the mechanisms of the mind and cognitive psychology in particular, I think is a very important part of modern evolutionary psychology. At the same time, there's no doubt that, anthropology, has deeply informed modern evolutionary psychology, especially, so-called biological anthropology. And that is really what I have always loved most about the field of evolutionary psychology is it is truly, it really is interdisciplinary. I mean, it's not a psychology, it's not a branch of psychology. I always say it's a perspective, that is equal parts biology, anthropology, some people would argue computer science and certainly cognitive science. So it's very wide ranging. You have to be reasonably well read on, a lot of different topics to appreciate modern evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned cognitive psychology, for example, and I think that was even the background of people like Lida Cosmides, I guess, and
Absolutely.
that's I think one of the reasons why, at least originally, I know that nowadays there are some people who dispute it, but originally, where the idea of the massive modularity of the human mind came from.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I consider Lida Cosmides unquestionably one of the founders of evolutionary psychology. Her and her husband, John Tooby. I mean, along with David Buss. But I think Lida Cosmides in particular did more than anyone else for bringing evolutionary psychology, into modern cognitive science, making it, bringing evolutionary psychology, sort of sharpening the focus on the mechanisms of the mind and the information processing mechanisms of the mind. And of course, she and John Tooby did a remarkable job in the early 90s, basically clarifying why it's important to focus on information processing mechanisms rather than expressed behavior. And I mean, I still, to this day, when I teach evolutionary psychology at the graduate level, we go back and we spend several weeks reading Tooby and Cosmides, a lot of their stuff, but in particular, addressing this distinction between evolved psychology and expressed behavior, because it is it's a slippery, sort of. It seems obvious when I'm saying the words, but it is something that trips people up. Probably myself too. But at any rate, yeah, I think that may be more than anything. Obviously, evolutionary biology, bringing evolution to the table, of course, it's huge, but and sort of a crux of the matter. But then, boy, bringing evolution to the mind, in particular, to the information processing mechanisms of the mind, is really fundamentally what's differentiated evolutionary psychology from, say, sociobiology or behavioral ecology.
Right. I mean, do you in your classes use the adapted mind as a source? Because I mean, I was just trying to understand if the adapted mind was one of the first books out there really giving a broad overview of what evolutionary psychology was to be about in the early 90s. So I was just trying to understand if nowadays it still stands, and I mean, if it was really a good way of theorizing evolutionary psychology almost 30 years ago.
Well, I mean, my response is yes, it absolutely still stands. And I still, in particular, their chapter, Psychological Foundations of Culture. I mean, if there was one single thing that someone, that I could encourage someone to read to understand evolutionary psychology, I would assign Psychological Foundations of Culture, that chapter, that 120-page chapter that they have. I think it still stands rock solid today. I mean, it basically is a version of Pinker's The Blank Slate.
Yeah.
And I think it represents, if you had to pick one thing that sort of captures what evolutionary psychology is, that chapter does it. I mean, it's wide-ranging, it's sweeping, but it also, gets at the heart of the matter in terms of information processing mechanisms of the mind. And, and then at the same time, of course, it addresses another massive confusion, which is the issue of cross-cultural, universality and cross-cultural variability. And I think they basically nailed it 30 years ago. 30 years ago? Yeah, almost.
Yeah, I think it was in 1992 it was
92,
published. Yeah.
So, I mean, even if I don't assign it in graduate courses, which I virtually always do, but I read it at least once a year. And I've read it at least once a year since 1992. So, I mean, it's, that's one evolutionary psychologist's opinion.
Yeah, but that's amazing. So, what would you say are the most foundational theories in evolutionary psychology? I mean, the ones from which you derive perhaps mid-level theories and then new hypotheses and so on.
Well, I would say, I mean, certainly Trivers and several of Trivers's theories have been, incredibly productive. Parent-offspring conflict, his theory of sexual selection, or his sort of modernization of some of Darwin's work on sexual selection. I mean, a lot of it does sort of turn on where a lot of the work is. It's on sex differences and mating and parenting sorts of behaviors. And, I mean, that is the case, that is where evolutionary psychology got a lot of its sort of, initial impetus, is from work on sexual behavior, mating, parenting, and a lot of Trivers's work in particular was, fundamental to getting those balls rolling.
Yeah. So let's talk then about sex differences. So if someone were to ask you, perhaps for you to explain in a simple manner, what are the kinds of steps, evolutionary steps, we have to understand to have a good grasp of where sex differences stem from, I mean, how would you put it?
Well, I would say, as simply as possible, and this would be true I'll just talk about humans. I mean, basically, you would expect sex differences only in those domains in which the sexes, that is males and females, have recurrently faced different adaptive problems. You wouldn't expect sex differences, for example, in, just speaking generally here, you wouldn't expect sex differences in various domains of nutrition, for example, or, exercise, or, you would expect them instead in areas that reflect sex-differentiated adaptive problems. So where males and females have recurrently faced, specific adaptive problems. So, one sort of blindingly clear sex difference is in gestating offspring, gestating and birthing offspring. I mean, you certainly would expect a suite of sex differences along lines related to, to parenting, for example, given the sex-differentiated adaptive problems that males and females have faced with respect to investing in and raising and caring for offspring, never mind gestating and birthing them. So that's how I would think about it, and that would be true for any sexually reproducing species. You'd expect sex differences only in those domains in which the sexes have recurrently faced different adaptive problems.
Right. But in order to understand, what were the mechanisms, the evolutionary mechanisms that led to the evolution of sex differences, we would have to look into sexual selection, but also, for example, things like intrasexual competition, right? Because I would imagine that perhaps different adaptations to different kinds of intersexual selection and intrasexual competition would lead to different sex differences or the rise of different sex differences. Am I thinking right here?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, of course, absolutely. You'd expect, again, sex differences where, right, the sexes recurrently face different adaptive problems. And typically, what it boils down to, one way of thinking about this is that the sexes typically don't invest equally in offspring, minimally speaking, that is. So the question is, what must a male invest in an offspring in order to bring it to reproductive maturity? And you can contrast that with what must a female invest minimally. And what you often find, certainly in mammals and certainly in humans, is that the investment of females is significantly, substantially greater, the minimum investment of females. And that means that females, women, have potentially more to lose in a poor mate choice or in poor decision making related to pregnancy and childbirth and producing offspring. And that then means that females also are in humans and in many species, not in all species, but in many species, females also are sort of the limiting resource, the limiting reproductive resource. And it's males, therefore, that must compete for access to females rather than females competing for access to males. Although even in humans too, females compete for access to highly valued males. But on average, what you see is that intersexual competition, that is competition between men, is often more intense, certainly more violent than it is among females.
Right. This parent-offspring conflict, or not parent-offspring conflict, before that, parental investment, does it stem from the fact that we have paternity uncertainty on the part of males? Is that the main reason why males tend to invest less in their offspring than females?
I would say that that's certainly an important reason, and it may be the main reason. It is a profoundly different adaptive problem for males and females. Males, ancestrally speaking, human males could never have been certain that the offspring that their partner was producing was in fact their own genetic offspring. And it's not that they had to be conscious of this, it's just that our ancestors are those men who behaved in a way that made it more likely that the offspring produced by their partners were in fact genetically their own. Females, aside from the switched at birth sort of scenarios in modern hospitals, females are always certain of maternity. Males are never certain of paternity. Again, aside from the fact that you can now do genetic testing.
Yeah, but that's a novel technology, so it wouldn't have any implications in terms of how we would have evolved. Right.
No, not at all. Yeah, and it may, no, certainly not. It wouldn't have any implications for understanding the design of the mechanisms of the mind related to paternity uncertainty, for example.
Could this differential parental investment have also anything to do with the fact that men and women have sort of different optimal reproductive strategies, in terms of the optimal reproductive strategy for men would be for them to try to impregnate as many women as possible, and so, I mean, they would perhaps seek out to do that instead of being with just one woman and investing all their resources into the offspring that would come from that woman, and the woman, perhaps the women would have another optimal reproductive strategy because they can't produce more than one offspring at a time, or at least one egg that lead to one offspring at a time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, that's the way to, that's certainly a very reasonable way to frame on average sex difference.
On average.
Yeah. I mean, on average, there's absolutely no doubt that men, are more interested in casual sex. They're more interested in more sexual partners. Now, that's not to say that there aren't women who are more interested in casual sex than many men. We know that that's the case. But on average, in every single culture for which we've collected data, I mean, which is now, in the hundreds, cultures, that is, and tens of thousands of participants. I mean, there's not a single culture where, on average, women seek short-term casual sex more than do men. And that's a very sort of typical mammalian sex difference.
Yeah, I mean, that's what people in psychology call sociosexuality, right?
Yes, sociosexuality. I mean, it's been framed with a lot of different terms, but yeah, I mean, that's what Gangestad and his colleagues 30 years ago called sociosexuality. That's right.
Yeah. So I would like to ask you about the sort of role that specific theories play in evolutionary psychology. So what about a life history theory? I mean, what does it add to the picture of evolutionary psychology that perhaps we wouldn't get from other sources?
Yeah, I'm sort of non-committal on the specific value of life history theory for evolutionary psychology. I mean, it's been very useful in predicting a variety of different sex differences in particular. But it's not clear to me, how well. I guess I want to be clear that I'm well aware that life history theory has its origins in non-humans. It has its origins in biology. Whereas evolutionary psychologists have grabbed a hold of life history theory and developed various means of assessing fast versus slow life history. I mean, it seems to me that what they're finding, including some of our own work and Nicole Barbero's work, is that there are sex differences. I mean, there are replicable sex differences in pursuit of short-term casual sex and investment in short-term, sort of immediate resource extraction or short-term mating, as contrasted with relatively longer-term perspectives and longer-term investment in fewer partners and fewer children, fewer offspring. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not clear to me that life history theory offers anything unique above and beyond, sociosexuality and sexual strategies theory as it was presented by Buss and Schmidt. But that may be just a consequence of my failure to understand the nuances of life history theory, and I concede that.
Right. And what about attachment theory? Because as far as I understand it, originally it was proposed by John Bowlby,
Sure.
and I mean, he was at the same time trying to develop a theory that had a biological basis, but he was also a psychoanalyst. So perhaps, I don't know, perhaps he took too much the role of the environment into account. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
What do you think about it, and where do you place it in the context of evolutionary psychology?
I guess, to speak as plainly as possible, I don't find much very useful in attachment theory. I find it more confusing, and I think it clutters things more than it clarifies things. Especially sort of classical attachment theory, the argument, with Bowlby and some of the early work. This argument that attachments, early in life are then sort of, they spill over into attachments later in life, and that just strikes me as not the way the mind is designed to operate. I mean, infant-parent relationships are profoundly different than romantic partner relationships, and I think you have a whole series of different adaptive problems involved. All of that said, certainly there are replicable patterns of relationships when you look at attachment styles, for example. I mean, we've done some of this work ourselves. In that, it's real data. Once again, I think similar to life history theory, it's not clear to me that attachment theory offers something unique, that it uniquely contributes to our understanding of the design of the mind. And I think much of what attachment theory contributes has been found with a different series of variables or terms in work that was, sort of inspired by sexual strategies theory, or some of the work by Gangestad and Simpson. So again, I'll concede that maybe I just don't have, a clear sense of just how valuable attachment theory is. Maybe I've, become blinkered by my early exposure to sexual strategies theory and some of this other work.
So, do you think, or I mean, I'm not sure if this is a fair question to ask or not, but do you think that evolutionary psychology, without having access to things like life history theory and attachment theory, would be able to get at the same kind of knowledge we derive from them by itself? I mean, by employing other kinds of theories?
I mean, I'm happy to be, to have the argument, but my answer at this moment is, yeah, I don't think you need attachment theory. I don't think you need life history theory. I don't think you need these theories to understand, the most important features of human psychology. I'm open to, to an argument otherwise. I'm not suggesting they're not useful. I'm just saying my reading of the literature is that they're not, our understanding of human psychology and behavior doesn't depend on, a deep appreciation of attachment theory or life history theory.
Mm-hmm. Do you, in your research as an evolutionary psychology, take into account things like, for example, Tinbergen's four questions? I mean, when trying to understand the workings and the evolution of specific psychological mechanisms?
I think it's important to. Personally, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about how mechanisms developed. I think it's a part of evolutionary psychology, but I don't think it's, the linchpin of evolutionary psychology. I mean, of course, I'm familiar with Tinbergen's work, and and I appreciate the contributions, and I'm glad there are people like Dave Bjorklund and David Geary who are doing interesting and important work on development, specifically on the development of evolved mechanisms. But I just don't find it all that interesting, personally.
Mm-hmm. Right, but I mean, if we take into account the four questions,
Yeah.
do you think that perhaps evolutionary psychology is more dedicated to answer one or two of it, or would it be able to answer all four of them?
I think that evolutionary psychology, the perspective, certainly is capable of answering all four of them. But I think you have to have, I guess it depends on. I don't think all four questions are equally important. I think evolutionary psychology is focused on, is most importantly focused on, the design features of psychological adaptations. I'm not discounting, that there is value in understanding how those mechanisms developed within a particular lifetime, or, how those mechanisms are built into the brain. And how they are, sort of expressed by, brain matter. But I see those questions as relatively more peripheral. But I think it's not like an evolutionary psychologist. Well, an evolutionary psychologist, I would say, is is someone who's focused on, again, on the cognitive machinery of the mind, on the information processing mechanisms of the mind, however they're built, however they develop. I mean, I always say in my classes that, and this, I mean, this is going to, I always say, I don't really care what the brain is made of. For all I know, it's made of bubble gum or Tinker Toys. I mean, it really doesn't, in some sense, matter. I mean, I'm interested in how these information processing mechanisms function. And again, I appreciate that there are people, and I'm grateful there are people who are deeply interested in, the neurophysiology of the brain. I just don't think that's critical to understanding the evolved mechanisms of the mind. But again, that's me.
Right. Would you say that evolutionary psychology is fundamentally an adaptationist approach to the human mind? I'm asking you that because, I mean, I remember even reading The Adapted Mind that Cosmides and Tooby and Barkow also mention things like, for example, byproducts and genetic drift. So, I mean, how do you deal with those kinds of things?
I would say that evolutionary psychology is fundamentally, presents or, encapsulates an adaptationist view of the mind. In other words, that the goal is to identify and describe, the adaptations of the mind, rather than, the byproducts of adaptations, or what Tooby and Cosmides refer to as the noise, the blips, the here and there sort of zigs and zags. I mean, the focus of evolutionary psychology is on, what is, one way to think about it is what is universal to all of psychology, or at least to all of one sex or the other sex. So in other words, yes, I think those are the most interesting questions, not just for evolutionary psychology, but for evolutionary biology. I mean, they're fundamentally adaptationist in the sense that, the goal is to understand the evolved mechanisms, in terms of evolutionary psychology, evolved mechanisms of the mind.
Right. Okay, so let me see if I can frame this question correctly. How do you deal with culture in evolutionary psychology? Because, for example, I remember again in the Adapted Mind, Cosmides introduces the concept of evoked culture, which is basically so we would have the same underlying evolved psychology, and by being exposed to different environments, different ecological circumstances, that would give rise to different cultures, different behaviors, and so on. But on the other hand, there's also the work by people who are not necessarily evolutionary psychologists, people like Joseph Henrich, who make a very, very compelling case that perhaps some of the features of our minds have been influenced by the kinds of cultures we've been living in, and perhaps also some psychological mechanisms derived from culture. So, I mean, where do you stand there, and how do you think about culture?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting area, and I think that that's one of the most interesting areas of evolutionary psychology. One of the most interesting future areas of evolutionary psychology is, often referred to as cultural evolutionary psychology or evolutionary cultural psychology. And, the way I think about it, and the way I think most evolutionary psychologists think about it, is, as Tooby and Cosmides sort of framed it in '92, the idea being that, I mean, culture is not some independent entity that, sort of reaches down, and manipulates psychology or builds psychology. I mean, culture is the product of psychology. It's the product of individual humans interacting socially. So I guess the bottom line is, my sense is that if you want to understand cultural differences or cultural similarities, there's nothing for it but to understand the evolved psychological mechanisms that produce those cultural behaviors. And I don't see how one can, make a huge amount of progress in cultural psychology without taking without appreciating that culture is produced by mechanisms of the mind. I do understand that there's work. I thought you were going to say work by like Pascal Boyer and Scott Atran, and there's a lot of neat work out there that looks at, okay, once the cultural product is out there, what happens to it, and how does it sort of infiltrate, how does it infiltrate groups, and how is it transmitted? And I think that's super interesting as well. And I don't think you necessarily need to appreciate the evolved mechanisms of the mind. I think it's probably super useful to understand how the mind is designed to get a hold of and to make, to sort of predict which cultural beliefs or values are likely to stick more than others. So again, I think it's a really, really interesting and I think it's a difficult area. But I see it as entirely consistent with, or entirely commensurate with, or cultural, a cultural psychology, one that focuses on either or both differences and similarities. I think will be greatly improved by an appreciation of the design of the mind. And similarly, I think evolutionary psychologists would do well to understand and to appreciate cultural differences as well as cultural similarities.
Right. And what do you think we learn, or what do we get by studying and comparing ourselves to other animals in terms of comparative psychology? I mean, what specific kinds of insights do we get from that?
Well, I mean, I think it's all but invaluable. I think it's really, really important to appreciate that humans are not the only species on Earth, that there are, multitudes of other species, many of which, let's just take mammals, many of which share, many of the same sets of adaptive problems, and therefore are likely to share, not guaranteed to share, are likely to share many of the same evolved solutions to those adaptive problems. I find this especially useful in a lot of my own work. For example, looking at things like rape in the context of intimate relationships. So there's a lot of work on rape in marriage or rape in long-term relationships. One of the explanations, or so-called explanations, for rape in intimate relationships, is sort of turns on, it's a consequence of, exposure to, modern television and messages that men receive about owning their partners and about controlling their partners.
Right.
But then one of the first things I often ask students is, does that make sense as an understanding of why ducks rape their partners, or why, actually rape is not at all uncommon among various avian species. But I mean, are you going to argue now that exposure to modern television is somehow accounting for why male ducks are much more likely to rape their partners than are female ducks to rape their partners? I mean, it's a rhetorical question. I mean, I think, no, I don't think that can't be the whole story. So I think it can be very useful to appreciate that there are, many other species that share some of the same, evolutionary history, some of the same adaptive problems, and therefore are likely to share some of the same evolved solutions to those adaptive problems. I know you've talked with my colleague here at Oakland University, Jennifer Vonk.
Right.
I mean, she and I have, over the years, really done what we could to try to bring these two areas together, comparative psychology and evolutionary psychology. But it's funny because, a lot of evolutionary psychologists don't seem to have, and the same is probably true for me, don't have sort of a deep appreciation for work on non-humans and for the psychology and behavior of non-humans. And I think it can be very useful as a way to sort of, limit, various hypotheses.
It's interesting that you mentioned Jennifer Vonk because she also came to my mind and I was about to mention her because in our interview back in 2018, one of the biggest topics we explored there was convergent evolution. And I mean, I was just thinking that perhaps when we think about comparing ourselves to other animals, we think about the most obvious ones, the ones that are more closely related to us, like chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and so on. But there's also very valuable work to do in terms of comparing ourselves to animals that, even if they are farther apart from us in terms of our evolutionary history, they were exposed to the same kinds of evolutionary problems and evolutionary pressures, and even developed or evolved the same kinds of solutions to those problems. So also comparing ourselves to those kinds of animals.
Oh yeah, I mean, so I've done a lot of work on the application of sperm competition theory to humans, and I mean, I freely admit that many of the hypotheses we've tested in humans, in mated men and women, so partner men and women, were directly inspired by work on birds. I mean, most birds are socially monogamous, and much of the work on sperm competition is focused on birds, including work on partner rape and domestic violence, and I mean, it's all there. And, you know, including some work, we published some work on in-pair copulatory frequency, so the frequency with which males pursue copulation. I mean, there's, you know, this work was all inspired, I mean, very directly from work on birds. And obviously humans aren't birds, but the mating system is very similar. You know, it's ostensibly monogamous. Both sexes, you know, are unfaithful to one another, and it's males but not females that risk paternity uncertainty, and therefore males are much more you know, sort of active in terms of, you know, direct mate retention behaviors. And then if you look at sperm competition in particular, you see many of the same behaviors, you know, in terms of, you know, the production of ejaculates, you know, the frequency of copulation. And so, I mean, I have found it incredibly valuable. And that's part of why I myself am biased in favor of a much broader appreciation of, you know, of comparative psychology and appreciating non-humans, because I've found it just, I mean, indispensable.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question that perhaps would be more for evolutionary biologists specifically, but in evolutionary psychology, do you take into account mechanisms like, for example, group selection? Do you use something like that to try to understand the evolution of certain psychological traits, or is that dispute between individual and group selection something that evolutionary psychologists do not care about that much?
I mean, I can't speak for all evolutionary psychologists. I can just speak
Sure.
for myself, and that, you know, my reading of the literature is that George Williams destroyed, you know, the utility of group selection. He basically nailed it in 1966 with his book Adaptation and Natural Selection, where he basically, you know, in very clear language, you know, made it very difficult to, you know, well, what he argued was that, you know, an understanding of group selection is unlikely to, you know, to be useful in terms of understanding the design of the mechanisms or the design of adaptations of the mind of most animals. Now, I mean, there are certain species where group selection, I think, can be very useful, but they're very peculiar sorts of species where, you know, the relatedness of individuals is much higher, for example, and, you know, there's no...
That would be, for example, the eusocial insects.
Yeah,
right?
social Hymenoptera, and you can, you know, where there's very little inflow or outflow, and so, you know, it's a very restricted sort of group, where basically, you know, individual bees are like cells in a body. And I think that's a very peculiar sort of arrangement, and that is where group selection is incredibly useful. But I'm not aware of a single example of an adaptation in humans, for example, that can be more efficiently described as the product of group selection than as the product of individual level selection. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying it's, the parameters are such that it strikes me as shockingly unlikely that group selection is going to offer anything useful to understanding the design of the human mind.
Right. So I would like to ask you also, what are your thoughts on the relationship between evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics? Because I've been thinking about this for a while, and I've had some people on the show that are both evolutionary psychologists and behavioral genetics, and the idea that I have is that since, in terms of evolution, genes is the way by which you transmit traits to the next generation, and the fact that in behavioral genetics we get to prove that certain psychological mechanisms have a genetic basis, wouldn't you think that they would marry well with one another?
You would think so. I know. I too have struggled with, how to integrate evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics. And I have a lot of colleagues who are behavioral geneticists, and I don't think anyone's done it. I don't think anyone has, successfully married, evolutionary psychology with behavioral genetics. We have a chapter, there's a chapter in the Handbook, and I always recruit behavioral geneticists to include, to contribute to, any handbook or, volume I happen to be working on in evolutionary psychology, because I think, the work that behavioral geneticists are doing, I think is very important work. And I think it gets at the heart of understanding individual differences. Look, we're talking about humans now, in any species, but with regard to humans, I think, there's no doubt that I myself don't know how best to wed these disciplines. Somebody's going to, make a huge contribution when they can, convincingly, marry these two disciplines, which I think are both, well, I'm an evolutionary psychologist, but I think behavioral genetics is incredibly important. And I think it may be the one discipline or area that's even more misunderstood than evolutionary psychology. So I think there's a lot of, optimistically speaking, I think there's great hope for massive progress in terms of wedding, these two areas, evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics. I'm just not sure, how that's going to all play out. I hope people continue to work on it, though.
Yeah, I was just also thinking that perhaps since behavioral genetics, at least as far as I understand it, it's one of the most scientifically solid social sciences. Because we have maybe 100 years of twin studies and stuff like that, and they replicate over time and time again. Perhaps, and since it's focused on genetics, of course,
Right.
and genetics is the basis for evolutionary biology, and in this case, evolutionary psychology. Perhaps, I also don't know how specifically you would marry both disciplines, but it would be very good, I think, for the social sciences.
Oh, absolutely. There are people who are actively struggling with this, AJ Figueiredo, who, I don't know if you've read any of his work. He's at Arizona, AJ Figueiredo, and then Brian Boutwell is doing some really neat stuff. These are, Brian Boutwell's a behavioral geneticist who, on the other side of things, appreciates that there's got to be a way to make some, defensible sense of this. But, and you mentioned, they're highly replicable, the results in behavioral genetics, not just in terms of, the replicability of heritability, but, all of this work on heritability is just as, important for, for understanding the environment. So we know that environmental effects also are incredibly replicable. Things are turning out to be a little bit different than we thought, in terms of, the shared environment versus the non-shared environment. But yeah, I think there's, just a huge amount of work, it seems to me, can be done and will be done. I noticed that you've spoken with, God, I just blanked on his name. He had a brand new book that came out just maybe a couple years ago, a behavioral geneticist.
Robert Plomin.
Yes, thanks. Yeah. Who, I mean, it's a wonderful book, and I think his, although I do also sense that not all behavioral geneticists seem to be interested in sort of bridging, their field with evolutionary psychology. He certainly does. He seems quite open to it, which is kind of strange, really. I mean, they seem averse to linking. Some behavioral geneticists seem rather averse to linking up with evolutionary psychology. At any rate, that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, do you think, and perhaps this will make a good segue to my question about individual differences, do you think that perhaps one of the difficulties in terms of trying to integrate evolutionary psychology with behavioral genetics is that behavioral genetics tends to focus much more on individual differences, and where they stem from, and evolutionary psychology would be more interested in universal psychological mechanisms?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's no doubt that, I mean, evolutionary psychology has, is built on, on a framework that's focused on, human nature, that is, on what all humans share, and then also on sex differences in particular. But, I mean, it's unquestionably the focus on, the area of individual differences is where evolutionary psychology, at least currently, is weakest. And has the hardest time understanding, I suppose that might well be true for evolutionary biology generally. But, I mean, this is not magical or mysterious. The work needs to be done. And I think that's part of why I am so optimistic about behavioral genetics, is that I think it's a pathway, to understanding how to frame and how to account for individual differences from, an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if this would be oversimplifying things too much or not, but I mean, it's also the case that even evolutionary theory originally predicted individual variation. I mean, and that's the basis for natural selection, selecting between individuals that differ across various dimensions. So.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, individual differences are are grist for the mill of natural selection. And yeah, I mean, it's one of those areas. I mean, the fact that there is work on individual differences from an evolutionary perspective, but the fact that it is sort of the most complicated, difficult, sort of challenging area is, in some ways kind of ironic. It reminds me of, the state of evolutionary psychology where there's almost no work on pregnancy, there is a little bit of work, but, it seems like such an obvious, sort of place where you might want to look if you were an evolutionary psychologist. And yet there's very little work on pregnancy and how that affects relationships. And I mean, again, there's a little bit of work, but it's always amazed me that, these sometimes the obvious stuff, it's just so obvious, that you can't see it. It's right in front of your face the whole time. And I think that's sort of how I've thought about individual differences for a long time. I mean, one of the things I think Toby and Cosmides, I think they, at least in their earliest work, they were, I mean, I can't recall sort of exactly what they said, but they were, sort of treated individual differences as, just sort of irrelevant blips and bleeps that really weren't all that interesting. And I think there was a special issue of the Journal of Personality that David Buss edited. I think he edited it. This was back in 1990. And I think Toby and Cosmides contributed a chapter, and basically people from various disciplines and areas tried to tackle individual differences from an evolutionary perspective. And more than any other set of authors, Tooby and Cosmides basically said there's much ado about nothing here. I mean, we don't need to spin our wheels on, on adaptive individual differences or patterns of traits. And I think, because they are so sharp and had already made important contributions, I think it may have sort of thrown some water on the fire of understanding individual differences. But at any rate, that was a long time ago. And I do think it's an interesting area. It's just, I find it incredibly challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I was just insisting a little bit on these kinds of integrative questions. I mean, of trying to understand how we could integrate different areas of psychology, because that's also one of the critiques that people, even scientists outside the social sciences, leverage against the social sciences, because it seems to be all disconnected fields. And I mean, at the same time, you look into specific areas, like, for example, as we said, behavioral genetics, evolutionary psychology, even the psychology of intelligence and so on, where people are doing very, very solid scientific work. And then, I mean, if we could try to get a way of integrating them, I mean, it would be great.
Oh, absolutely. I think evolutionary psychology, well, you mentioned evolutionary psychology, behavioral genetics, I think have done a much better job by necessity, of, forging links with other disciplines, biology, right, anthropology, I mean, it does feel sometimes like a lot of psychology is really, it's like an echo chamber. They're just talking to themselves and don't seem to appreciate that there are other disciplines. I'm sure I'm guilty of it as well. But at any rate, yeah, I think it is a criticism of psychology for sure. And I think that's one of the benefits of taking an evolutionary perspective, is that you're appropriately, drawing from, other disciplines.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there is any weird problem in evolutionary psychology? I mean, in the sense of focusing too much on the so-called weird societies? Because, I mean, I'm asking you this because it strikes me that evolutionary psychology, at least it seems to me, is one of the most cross-cultural disciplines out there. I mean, you get lots and lots of studies where people are trying to look at the same issues in tens of different societies across the globe, and even societies even outside of the Western sphere, to be more universal, let's say. And then, I mean, perhaps the only other area where people do that is anthropology, but maybe because many times people come into anthropology with a different theoretical lens, like, for example, cultural anthropology, where they're much more focused on the differences across societies. I mean, perhaps they don't deal with the information the same way evolutionary psychologists do. So what do you think about it?
Yeah, but I think, right, I think evolutionary psychology in particular has less of a problem with, studying Western, people's, weird samples than arguably any other discipline, any other area within psychology. I mean, I think you're right that, I mean, this isn't something new either. I mean, evolutionary psychology has, a long history of cross-cultural research. I mean, dating back to, Buss's, now well-known work, on mate preferences. And so I think in some ways, evolutionary psychology should be held up as sort of the, an example of, a discipline, an area, that appropriately, assesses or values, non-Western samples. At the same time, humans are humans. I mean, whether you happen to be in a hunter-gatherer tribe or in, Rochester, Michigan, you have the same basic evolved mechanisms. And that's an area where I think, and maybe I would say this, but I think that's, very much has been made of, the reliance on so-called weird cultures. I think too much has been made of that. I think there's no reason to expect that, studying college students, it depends on the topic, but if you're interested in mating psychology, it's just as reasonable to study college students in Michigan as it is to study, the Hiwi or the Ache. It's not like you're going to get some magically clearer answer if you study the psychological mechanisms as they exist in non-Western peoples. And I often think that, some of the pushback, from anthropologists, they seem to think that data from non-Western cultures is somehow more useful. Generally, I find that, why? Why would it be more useful that it happens to be coming from the mind of someone located in a hunter-gatherer tribe? At any rate, I think a bit too much has been made of the reliance on so-called weird samples. Nevertheless, evolutionary psychology has, arguably done more than perhaps anthropology itself, for collecting data from non-Western populations.
Is evolutionary psychology an area that has also suffered with the replication crisis? I was just trying to understand that if perhaps by having this sort of theoretical basis we've been talking about in connection with other disciplines like evolutionary biology and so on, having this strong biological basis and the fact that since its very beginning it has been trying to look across different cultures, different societies, that perhaps it wouldn't suffer from the replication crisis as the same as other disciplines, as much as other disciplines.
Yeah, well, and that's what the data seem to suggest. Some of the classic findings, produced by evolutionary psychologists, work on sex differences in mate preferences and sex differences in desire for sexual variety. These are some of the most robust findings. They have been replicated not just across cultures, but across historical periods. We've done some of this work, and others have as well. I think that's exactly right. I think part of the, that was never the intention, was to produce results that would be, immune to a replication crisis. But I think by virtue of the fact that, many of the theories that inform evolutionary psychology are theories that are, that cross-cut many different species and many different disciplines. So there's that, and the fact that evolutionary psychology has, almost from the beginning, been a cross-culturally sort of active field. I think at the end of the day, that may help to account for why evolutionary psychological research has tended to fare better in terms of, replicability and the robustness of findings.
Right. So I would like to get now into the more muddy questions, let's say, and talk about things like morality/ethics and the sort of political aspects that people tend to attach to evolutionary psychology. So, one of the things that we can study by using an evolutionary lens is human morality. We have evolutionary ethics, for example, and there are philosophers who approach ethics through an evolutionary lens. By studying how human morality evolved and perhaps the sort of emotions that we have attached to moral questions and how we perhaps universally tend to think about different moral questions, would you say that evolutionary psychology can be prescriptive in any way, or is it simply descriptive?
Well, I think it's primarily descriptive. I must say that I think this is another area that I think is really, really interesting, and I think has a very bright future in terms of, progress. Also, I think it's a very challenging area. This gets us into questions of, can science inform our ethics? Can science inform our morality? I mean, I actually find, I realize there's lots of, arguments about this and lots of, but I mean, if you argue that what is moral is that which decreases suffering, well then, if you understand what causes suffering, I mean, then there's a sense in which, evolutionary or science generally can inform what is good and what is right. So if, we can, I think this is, Sam Harris probably made it most well known, but, the argument that, if, behaviors that, inflict unnecessary suffering, which we've identified as doing so, scientifically, well, then we can say that those are wrong. Those are morally wrong behaviors. So there is a sense in which science can inform morality, but I think that's certainly not where most of the work right now is in evolutionary psychology. I think most of that work is still in the business of describing the evolved psychological mechanisms that produce moral feelings or moral emotions. I don't know if that gets at what you were asking me.
Yes, it gets. And I mean, more specifically, nowadays, for example, people are very interested in animal ethics and issues having to do with animal welfare. Do you think that disciplines like evolutionary psychology could also provide people with important knowledge as to, for example, when we compare ourselves to other animals and vice versa, perhaps get to a better understanding of the kinds of mental experiences other animals have, and also perhaps how we should treat them?
Yes, I think that's a great point. I'm not sure evolutionary psychology is uniquely situated to do that, but I think one way to improve the way, just for example, we treat animals is to appreciate that they have a complex psychology that includes the production of emotions that we would recognize. And certainly, for example, that species like cows and chickens and pigs are quite capable of experiencing intense suffering. And I think we know that on the basis of, at a minimum, of scientific research that provides evidence that heart rate increases when an animal experiences pain, that breathing increases. None of these are sort of lockdown proof, but I think to the extent that we're better understanding the way that non-human minds operate and the fact that they do operate, I think contributes, or at least can contribute to, what I would argue would be a more moral, way of living.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I perhaps also asked you that question because I also wanted to know to what extent are evolutionary psychologists interested in studying the sort of more subjective aspect of our psychological lives. I mean, not only how the psychological mechanisms operate, but perhaps how we ourselves consciously experience things. I mean, is that something that evolutionary psychologists also do work on or not?
Yes, definitely. As you were speaking, I just thought of some of the work on pain and the experience of pain. This is a fundamentally subjective experience, at least in the way that we're talking about. Literally assessing, people's sort of moment-to-moment, changes in pain, and identifying, for example, sex differences in, some of the pain reports. But all of which is to say, yes, I think evolutionary psychology has sort of a history of investigating some of these questions. And then, as I was just now talking, I was thinking about sexual arousal. That's a subjective experience, and there certainly is work asking people about their experiences with sexual arousal, sexual fantasy. These are profoundly subjective sort of reports. So yeah, at the same time, I think there's a lot more work that could be done looking at subjective experiences.
Mhm. So now talking about politics, because I mean it's very easy for people, particularly right-wing people, to pick up on findings from evolutionary psychology and other biologically based sciences and make a case for defending their kind of ideology. I mean, the sort of simplistic way of looking at sex differences, for example, and say that because men and women evolve this or that way, then they should in society behave this or that way or fill this or that role. I mean, is there anything in evolutionary psychology that really, just from a scientific point of view, would allow for people to use it in a political way? I mean, is it something in the science itself that could be political in any way?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that there's anything in the science in and of itself that necessarily, you know, demands, you know, a right, you know, sort of a right-wing perspective or a left-wing perspective. I mean, I don't think so. I think these are two separate questions. I mean, I agree that people do, you know, grab a hold of these things, and you know, I mean, but the fact is that, I mean, there is work on the political, you know, perspectives of evolutionary psychologists, and it's a, you know, like most scientists, evolutionary psychologists are extremely left-leaning.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They're super liberal and
Yeah, I mean that study, I think that from 2008 or 2009 by Geoffrey Miller and Joshua Tybor, who looked into
right.
the political leanings of evolutionary psychologists, right?
Yeah, and they're really, I mean, again, it's been a while since I looked at that work, but my recollection is that evolutionary psychologists are not any more right-leaning than any other, you know, group of, you know, social scientists or scientists. And so, yeah, I think it's just another tactic that people who misunderstand evolutionary psychology attempt to, you know, tar and feather, you know, evolutionary psychologists rather than engage the arguments. I mean, I think it's been pretty successful too, you know, and so in the sense of how evolutionary psychology is perceived. I think it's perceived as, you know, this, at least by some portion of the public, or at least some portion of academia, as, you know, more right-wing, you know, than I think it is. I mean, it's a scientific discipline, and I'm sure there are evolutionary psychologists who are very right-leaning, just as I'm sure there are evolutionary psychologists who are very left-leaning. And so I don't think there's anything, you know, about evolutionary psychology that necessitates a particular political perspective.
Right. I don't know if you agree with me, but I mean, for example, the left-wing people tend to be much more easily bothered by things like sex differences, or in this case, or in this case, trying to understand the biological basis of sex differences, because it's not that they also, for example, people from sociology also study sex differences, but they tend to put it more into a social, cultural perspective and try to understand where they come from. I mean, how society influences the rise of these sex differences that we find. But I mean, at the same time, isn't it the case that, at least this is what I think, that evolutionary psychology, because it tries to understand or know what is the universal evolved psychology of humans, that perhaps, I mean, it also tells us that we share things with all other humans. I mean, and perhaps this political focus on the differences, being it sex differences or any other kind of individual differences, I mean, that's just ideological, right?
I mean, I would say yes. I mean, I think that is the case. It does strike me as ideological, and I mean, I agree that it's people on the left. My sense is that most of them are not scientists, though. They're like, they're non-scientists. I'm not suggesting they're not smart. I mean, many of them are super smart, but I think they're deeply blinkered and confused. Yeah.
Yeah. I would just like to talk about one last topic. So
Sure.
the topic of evolutionary mismatches. I mean, first of all, what is exactly an evolutionary mismatch? I mean, I don't know if you like to give us for an example or just explain the concept generally.
Yeah, I think, uh, well, an evolutionary mismatch, if depends, just to make sure we're talking about the same thing. I mean, this
Yeah.
would be, so it's often talked about with respect to humans. And so the question is, I mean, is it ever the case that, you know, that adaptations find themselves in novel environments? And to the extent that there's a mismatch between, somehow I don't like the term mismatch, but at any rate, um, might it be the case that our evolved psychology, um, you know, produces behaviors that, you know, are harmful to us in a way that they're unlikely to have been harmful to us in our evolutionary past? And so I think a great example is there's very good evidence that, you know, that universally humans have evolved mechanisms that motivate, you know, and that motivate them to pursue and find, you know, um, super tasty things that are high in fat, high in sugar. Um, you know, I think the argument is that, you know, our ancestors are likely to have very rarely, occasionally stumbled upon ripe fruit, and, you know, better eat it now because you don't know when's the next opportunity you might have. The problem is that those mechanisms, you know, we have those mechanisms, those evolved mechanisms, and they can, you know, they can produce a lot of problems for modern humans where you have super easy access to, you know, to fast foods, you know, that are just loaded. I mean, they taste wonderful. They're loaded with high fat, high sugar, and people eat these things, you know, much more frequently than is likely to have been the case in our evolutionary past. And as a consequence, you know, modern peoples in the Western world, you know, experience much higher rates of, you know, cardiovascular disease and, you know, high blood pressure and all sorts of problems related to, you know, heavy consumption of, you know, high fat, you know, high sugar foods. So there's a mismatch in the sense that we have an evolved psychology that is located in an environment that has various features that were rare in terms of the frequency of these features that were rare in our ancestral environment, but are now widely accessible. So that's one example of an evolutionary mismatch. And so yes, I think there is great value in understanding and appreciating, you know, how unique features of our modern environment, you know, are processed by our evolved mechanisms of mind that evolved to solve problems in a sometimes very different environment, one that didn't include electricity, one that didn't include, you know, crushing populations, one that didn't include, you know, rapid access to extraordinarily high fat, high sugar foods. There.
Right. I mean, I mean, and since we were also earlier talking about culture and where it comes from, I mean, since the kinds of environments we create or develop also stem, at least in part, from our evolutionary psychology. I mean, even things like fast food and things like that. I mean, it's not that we came up with a completely different nutrient that we weren't exposed to at all during our evolutionary history that is part of fast food. I mean, so at least in a sense, I think we are partly adapted even to our modern environments because the things we created stem from that underlying evolved psychology.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I think the mismatch or the problem is that, you know, it's I just had sorry, I thought for a moment about so-called super stimuli, you know,
Right.
where there's no doubt that, I mean, it's not an arbitrary set of, you know, features of our environment that we've produced. I mean, you're absolutely right that, you know, high fat, high sugar foods are so widely available because people purchase them, because people love them. And the problem is that we don't have like a shutdown valve, to say that's enough sugar, that's enough fat. On top of the fact that we get far less exercise, just physical exercise, than we are likely to have gotten ancestrally. So I think it's a combination of factors. Yes, but I think, right, to understand the production of these, these sorts of cultural paraphernalia, you have to understand, evolved psychology. But the fact that it's produced by evolved psychology clearly doesn't guarantee that it, therefore, however you define good, is going to be good for us.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So just one last question.
Sure.
What are for you some of the most interesting questions that evolutionary psychology hasn't answered yet and that you would like to see explored in the future?
Well, I mean, we've actually talked about two of those areas. I mean, just to cast a very wide net, I think individual differences remain. I think we've made some progress for sure, but I think there's much more interesting work to be done on understanding individual differences. I think evolutionary psychology has done a fantastic job, Buss and his colleagues, of outlining when and under what conditions we might expect sex differences. Even when and why we might expect species differences, that is, differences between, say, chimps and humans. But I think it remains, there's a lot of puzzles that remain about individual differences. I mean, the fact that, that there really hasn't been a successful marriage of behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology, at least that's broadly accepted, I think suggests that that can be resolved. I mean, but at least maybe that's an optimistic way to frame things. I think individual differences are the most important broad domain that remain to be understood from an evolutionary perspective. And I think the other area is morality. And I think that is also fascinating and challenging, and I think will, the work that has been done on morality has focused mostly on, it's been very human-centered, which makes sense. I mean, but again, I think there's more that we can do, in terms of appreciating non-humans and, sort of the, call it morality. I mean, I'd call it morality. I know some people sort of balk at talking about morality in non-humans. They sometimes.
I mean, are you referring, for example, or alluding to the work by Franz de Waal when he talks about chimpanzee morality and politics and stuff like that?
I mean, I think that's the way we should talk about it. I think there's a lot that we can learn about human morality by better appreciating how non-humans, sort of perceive and react to questions of fairness and unfairness. So I find it very interesting, and I find it very enlightening. But I think that's an area where I think there's going to be further progress. I would say Jennifer Vonk has done some really neat work. I mean, there's a group of people who are doing work on morality. They call it morality in non-humans. I mean, whether it's rats or dogs or or chimps. I think there's a lot of interesting work that remains to be done, particularly in helping to paint an integrated picture of morality and sort of bringing in work on dogs and rats and chimps and humans. But it's many careers worth of research and work there.
Yeah, sure. So the book is again the Sage Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. Dr. Shackelford, would you like to mention where people can find you on the internet?
Yes, I do have a lab webpage, which is www.toddshackelford.com. And there you can find links to to the Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology, and as well as to other volumes we published and our research articles and links to our lab members and so forth. So it's all there, and I'm always, you know, anyone's welcome to contact me by email as well.
Okay, great. So again, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and as always, I hope to have you somewhere in the future again on the show because you're already an old guest of the show. So thank you again for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Ricardo.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. So, to keep the channel sustainable and to keep it running, I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page. You have all sorts of benefits there, and any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. You also have links to PayPal in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Lenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Forrest Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columba, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Meira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roch, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, my producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Brett, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.